for Mr. Frierson, who should be here any moment, and we'll change out when that happens. But I would like to call to order the Audit Committee on Thursday, March 23rd, 2023. Can I have approval of the minutes? It was moved by Mr. Durrett, and we have a second. Mr. Pond. The minutes are approved. Next on our agenda is a briefing on the internal audit activity, Quarter 2, Fiscal Year 23 Audit Committee from March 23rd, and Mr. Emil is going to give us all of our updates today.
Good morning, Mrs. Hardage, Mr. Greenwood, members of the Audit Committee and the MARTA Board. Good morning. My name is Emil Zanoff. I'm your Head of Internal Audit, and I will give you a briefing of the internal audit activities for the MARTA fiscal second quarter of fiscal year 23, which begins on October 1st and ends December 31st, 2022. That's the holiday period, as I call it. Next slide, please. During the second quarter of the fiscal year, the operational audit group finished and issued one audit report related to excessive absenteeism and bus operator availability. This was an interim report. We'll go back from an audit perspective to do some follow-up procedure probably next fiscal year. That's why we called it an interim report. This report made three recommendations on three significant findings. One is related to the absence of written policies and procedures to specifically address excessive absenteeism by represented employees. The second finding related to a lack of reconciliation ability between the data that's in HRIS, or the HR information system, and the operational bus data. They look at different data sets, and that creates some issues as it relates to solving this problem. And thirdly, there is no documented definition for what really constitutes bus operator availability and how it should be calculated. This was more of a I would call it a management consulting recommendation, and I've been in the consulting world in prior careers, and oftentimes I've seen when people use the same words but they mean different things, because words usually are common words, but sometimes we talk past each other when we don't define the terminology and we don't define the calculation mechanism, so we can actually focus on the same thing and move forward to solve the problem. So kind of like management consulting 101, define it, write it down, define how you calculate it, and then focus on improving the problem and measuring your progress. And I'll pause here for a second.
You can go ahead and we'll just switch out here for you.
Okay. At the same time, during the quarter, we kicked off three new audits. One is in the space of direct pay. The second one is non-revenue vehicle use audit, and the third one is the transit-oriented development process audit. The direct pay process is a follow-up audit. We've had some prior incidents of fraud many years ago, and we wanted to make sure that we have the right controls in place to minimize the risk of fraud occurring in that space. We have finished this audit, and I will report to the audit committee when we issue the report. We have a meeting in May, so I will report the outcome of that during the month of May. Non-revenue vehicle fuel use audit. These are really the MARTA fleet vehicles, police vehicles. We use fuel cards where people can go to fuel pumps and fuel the MARTA vehicles, or we have fuel pumps at the bus garages. We wanted to make sure the controls are there to, again, minimize the risk of fraud and financial leakage. TOD process, transit-oriented development process. The reason we wanted to engage that organization from an auditing perspective is it's an important function of the authority. It's important for MARTA. It's important for the community. We have really never had an audit baseline, if you will. We haven't reviewed that from an audit perspective, so we thought this would be a good time to go and review their controls, policies, and procedures, and establish an audit baseline, if you will, going forward. Next slide. Again, staying with the operational audit space, these are prior audits from previous quarters that we have discussed here in this room at various audit committee meetings. We track 4 audits that have still, well, there are actually 3 that have open findings. 1 was just recently closed, and we will discontinue following it. This is the bus maintenance audit. We were satisfied with the evidence they provided, so we will consider that audit completely closed and findings corrected. The capital improvement program follow-up audit, there was a number of recommendations. As a reminder, we audited horizontally the CPMO process as it relates to the various different elements of project management and governance. We issued a number of recommendations. 19 have been closed. 9 are in various different stages of being closed. The world of internal auditing is a little bit binary. We can't call something closed if it's 70% closed or 80% closed. It has to be 100% closed. So we continue to track this remediation, and we'll continue to work with Carrie and her people to make sure this thing actually go through the finish line. And then capital project soft cost and online invoicing. These are very recent audits, and we're kind of working with the capital improvement team on the remediation of those findings as well. These are horizontal audits that apply to the entire capital program. And just for clarification, ALIS, which is the last line, that refers to the billing system where the consulting invoices are getting in from, whether it's Archer Western or whether it's another company that does station renovation. That's where we process and approve their invoices, including labor rates and overhead rates. So we audited that system across the board. A number of findings have been closed, as the slide indicates. There's still findings that we're going to continue to track until they're completely remediated. So we remain focused in that space from an operational audit perspective across the entire authority. Let's move to the next slide. Switching over to our information technology audit group. During the second quarter, we issued a comprehensive audit of our third-party IT risk management. This audit covered the way we manage risks of our third-party technology, IT technology providers. This does not refer to any third party, but it does refer to IT technology. And the reason we did that is because more and more of our critical IT services are being provided by third parties, or they're being moved to the cloud. And this should not be a surprise to anybody. This is the general trend in the overall economy, is to source more and more services from third parties or to move them to the cloud. The issue with that is there needs to be a pretty robust risk management process. Many of the major breaches in history have been committed through third parties, and I'll give you several examples. The Target famous or infamous Target breach was done through their HVAC vendor. The breach that happened at the Home Depot came through their vendor that was supporting their point-of-sale computers. One of the Las Vegas casinos, their high roller database was stolen through a smart thermometer in a fish tank, of all things. So we have to manage the risk. We identified four findings related to terms and conditions and the general operating effectiveness of some of the controls that we have. We found that we do have controls. However, they need to be strengthened, and we will monitor very closely how those controls become more effective. At the same time, moving to the next two lines, we kicked off two new audits: identity and access management. Who connects to our network? Who can get in, do stuff, and get out? Identity and access management. That's Cybersecurity 101. And secondly, this is not a cybersecurity audit. That's the IT support of critical enterprise applications. Again, this is more of a production support of critical IT infrastructure, because as much as we love cybersecurity, and that's critically important, we also want to make sure that our day-to-day IT business gets done the right way. Let's switch to the following IT audit slide. Next slide, please. These are prior IT audit. Oracle disaster recovery was discussed at the previous audit committee. There were 3 significant findings, and we're tracking the remediation of those 3 significant findings. Oracle is a very important system to us, and we're watching this like hawks to make sure that these findings get remediated. The second line is our train control pen test finding remediation review. You will note that 4 items have been closed and 6 were marked as past due. As a matter of fact, I've had several conversations. The latest one was yesterday with Mr. Daniel Hecht, who is leading the remediation there. They're doing a lot of good work. They need more time to get it done. They've promised me to get it done by the beginning of October. We'll continue to engage with them on a very regular basis to make sure that the devices which need to be upgraded, and I realize, because I know a lot about this business, when you upgrade devices on various trains and buses, you want to do it in a deliberate and well-planned manner, and sometimes that takes time, and I recognize that. Having said that, we're going to continue to watch this until it gets done. The last 2 items are more in the IT and cyberspace, and then we'll close them when those findings get remediated. And I have to apologize to the audit committee, because I intentionally keep the conversation at a somewhat high level without going to the details of which devices were exposed, because we're in a public forum. I just, forgive me for that. I just have to do it that way. So we're monitoring these findings until they get remediated, or we understand how the risk is being handled. Let's move to the next slide. We're switching over to the contract audit group. We issued 37 contract audits, very highly productive quarter. As you all know, that audit group, it's kind of like a pipeline. We get audit requests from various different contractors. We audit them. We issue the audit reports. We issued 37 audit reports. We had 1 that needs attention. 1 was labeled as high risk. At the same time, we exited the quarter December 31st with 19 audits in progress. We identified unsupported costs of about $3.2 million. This was really only 1 contract. It was a single source procurement, and the vendor chose to refuse to provide the documentation that was needed to conduct the audit the way it should be conducted, so we could not support and substantiate their cost. Next slide. Switching over to the fraud, waste, and abuse process. It was a quiet quarter. Actually, we did not get any new reports through our independent third-party fraud hotline. We finished the investigation, which we kicked off during that quarter. That was investigation 2301I9, which we talked about the last time. It related to a manager who was alleged to have booked one of the represented employees as being on vacation while they were actually in jail. We discussed the findings and our conclusions with the management team, and after consideration, they determined that they would not apply disciplinary action in this particular case. We don't have any new, or we didn't have any new investigations or reports that came through the fraud line, which will allow us to spend a little bit more time on finishing some of our audits. That concludes the fraud and waste summary. I took the liberty of adding a new slide to the audit committee packet this time around. So let's switch to the next slide. And that slide is what's on our radar screen for the near and long term. First of all, in the near term, we have the May audit committee meeting. It's really only going to be 2 months. At that committee meeting, we'll discuss our Q1 results. At the same time, you should expect to see me presenting to you our draft internal audit plan for fiscal year 24 for your consideration and feedback. At the same time, we should expect to have Crow LLP that will give you an overview of their plans for their financial audit on our books for fiscal year 23. So it'll be a little bit different dynamics at the next audit committee meeting. I also wanted to point a couple of emerging risks, and some of them are on the slide and some of them are just something I would talk about in the interest of the committee. One is around critical infrastructure. Every declassified briefing that I have read from the intelligence community talks about the increased risk to to critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, given the geopolitical situation that we're in. Every declassified briefing I've read talks about the extremely sophisticated capabilities that countries like Russia and China have to infiltrate and stay persistent in terms of critical infrastructure. So we're monitoring that risk, and we'll take it into account as we create our next year's audit plan, as we have done in the past. The next one is related to TikTok. A lot of discussion. As you probably know, it was banned on anyone holding a federal government issued device, as well as I believe the state of Georgia also banned its use on devices that are issued by the state of Georgia. Oftentimes there is politics involved in that, so I do always my own independent research. I looked at the risks. I also looked at the responses that the company provided, and I was personally and professionally not satisfied with the responses provided by the company itself in a public way. So I believe, as a professional in this business, that TikTok remains a risk for the devices on which it is installed. And I'll leave it at that. But that's my personal professional opinion. The next bullet point talks about the number of derailments that we have heard about and witnessed, some of them creating a lot of issues. We're paying attention and trying to read as much as we can about root causes and things of that nature. It's always better to learn from other people's mistakes than from your own. But we're considering this as we formulate our audit plan for next year. I'm not saying we're going to do an audit, but we're thinking about it. Also, for the balance of this fiscal year, we're going to kick off several operational audits of capital projects in each of the jurisdictions that we serve. We're right now in the process of determining which projects to pick, but we'll pick probably 3 to 4 projects, and then we'll conduct more of an operational audit of how those projects are being executed, and we'll report back to the audit committee when we're done with the audit. So we continue to kind of pay attention to that area as well, and I know that's near and dear to all of your hearts. So with that said, I would conclude my briefing, and we'll turn it over back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Emil. Appreciate it very much. Do apologize for the delay. Just started late and arrived late. So thank you, Frida, for starting the meeting. Do we have any questions from the board? Okay. I don't see a light here, but I say Mr. Pond.
I've got a couple of questions, Emil, and I think you're right about some of these programs like TikTok. I think there's some long-term concerns there. But my question to you is, under the prior IT audits, one goes back to 2019, and I know has to do with all of the PCs and emails, and then more recent ones with pen test. Is some of that takes that length of time, or is it a budget issue, manpower issue? I'm looking at one going back to 2019 that you have high risk, and then a couple others in 22 that you're planning to address. I know in the past there have been some budget issues and manpower issues. So.
Right.
So that's my first question.
I will give you my answer because I owe it to you. And then maybe I'll invite Mr. Malice to also provide sort of the people that really know the answer. But I think some of that is related to the complexity of ripping out an old system that's embedded in your environment. And again, I don't want to mention what that is. We had a conversation during the pre-briefing, and we went into a lot of details about that. But some of it is related to kind of ripping out some of the old stuff that's embedded in the environment and doing it without causing a business disruption. Having said that, it is a risk. I can't call it any other thing. So hopefully that gives you my perspective.
All right, Dean? What did you have
Good
some
morning.
thoughts?
I mean, just to echo what Emil said, there is on some of the systems, without getting into specifics, right, you've got infrastructures that will need to be removed and then replaced. So there is budgets that have to be appropriated, and that's really Kirk's side of the house. Then there's staffing that needs to implement, and then there's disruptions on that. We are making some progress. It's just slow. As Emil said, it is a risk. I've got it on my risk register, and at some point we might have to just accept that risk if it's going to take us too long to do those remediations.
Okay. Emil, I had one other question. Your first slide, you talked about the operations excessive absenteeism, and I know we have some union issues there. Maybe this is a colleague Greenwood question, but what do we do with that? I mean, what is the outcome?
In terms of a solution for excessive absenteeism?
Right.
Yeah.
You identified, so what?
Yeah. So we've started that. There are some structural changes we've undertaken at the divisional level in terms of focusing workforce, supervisory workforce to absenteeism follow-ups. There are some corrective actions plans that we've taken in terms of really sticking to the script when someone is not meeting the corporate expectations of absenteeism and what we do about that and how quickly we act. And then finally, there are some structured reward programs that we're planning to roll out in the very near future to entice people to step up in terms of their absenteeism. But that we recognize that when we started bringing back our full workforce and still had 18 to 25% absenteeism in the operating ranks, we realized that the old, whatever the old system was, just wasn't working. So we have there are 3, 4, 5 new people coming on board that are specifically targeting absenteeism in the operating ranks.
And I would just echo that we have a task force which came up with a number of recommendations on this, when I say with the authority. And I know that this thing exists and gets some recommendations developed and sort of on the way to implement them, because I participate as an observer. I can't influence their decisions, but I observe what they do. And the good news is we have it now in an audit report, because oftentimes you can have a task force, you can have recommendations, you got to get them done, right? So we'll keep track of it.
Yeah, and that task force, thank you for reminding me, that's Peter Bruno's heading that up from an operations perspective with lots of support from the HR team. And they have made some really solid recommendations, one of which is, the organizational changes that we've just spoken about.
Okay. All right, Mr. Dewar?
Collie, this is probably for you. Given the request from City Council, and I'm looking at the external financial audit that Crow is conducting for us for 23, and that we have conducted annual financial audits every year. Is there some way to utilize the results of our external financial audits to provide City Council with the information that we believe they are seeking?
Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, number one is we are an audit-friendly environment. We believe in audits. We run our business that way on a regular basis. I mean, Emil can better tell you just how many audits, internal and external, we insist on for ourselves. If Crow's audit lends itself to a sense of satisfaction for City Council, of course, we want to share that with them. But my sense from reading their resolution, the questions that they were asking are less of a financial audit and more of a, management decision audit or review. So, my commitment is whatever it is they need to feel satisfied, that's what we will provide them. That, in fact, is what we have been in the process of doing. We have a, pre-scheduled from several weeks ago, a meeting this afternoon with the mayor's office to, in fact, walk through our finances. So our budget team is meeting with their budget team and, in hopes to answer any remaining questions that they have. The audit request kind of came separately from that, and, at the end of the day, we'll see what questions remain. If nothing else, MARTA remains an open book. So whether it's the Crow audit or some other form of review or audit, we're committed to making sure that they're satisfied.
Any other questions from the board?
Yes, my light is on. I don't
Oh,
know
yes,
if
go
you
ahead,
can
read
see
it.
there.
Mrs. Scott?
I have a couple of questions in regards to prior IT audits with open findings. And I noticed the dates, for instance, one where we still had a past due. It shows the issue date 4/15/22. Well, we have several with past due. And we're now into 23. Has that data changed?
Can you please go back to that slide so everyone can have an opportunity to see that?
And if it hasn't, how are we progressing?
There you go. Okay. So the second column, which is, I think you're referring to the second column called audit report issue date. So we issued, or we formally delivered that report to the management team on that date. Now, since then, they've made progress, and I'll pick on one of them, let's say the enterprise pen test remediation, which is the 4/15/22. Since then, they've closed 4 of the 5 findings,
Right, so where
and
are
one remains open.
Right, so how are we progressing? It's a year now with that one, or also with the 6 in the TCSN pen test.
Right.
All of them but one have a past due quantity. So are we progressing with the past due quantity at this time? And do we have a process in place for completing those that are past due?
Correct. I think the answer is a little different depending on the audit that we're reviewing. If you look at this number 1 enterprise pen test findings remediation, this is where we talked about some obsolete technology that's deeply embedded in our system, and quite frankly, it's been very, very difficult to rip that out. Eventually we will, but at some point I think the authority will have to make a decision whether it's willing to live with the risk long-term or whether some short-term measures has to be taken. And when that decision is made, we'll remove that item from this list. But right now they're trying to find a solution, but it's how should I say that? It's a technically pretty complicated challenge. It's almost like you're driving your car and you're trying to replace the computer on your Tesla as you're driving the Tesla. It becomes a bit of a challenge when you do that. So that one item, if you go up one line item to the number 6 under the TCSN pen testing remediation, I feel like there is a clear line of sight and a progress is being made, and there is a trajectory to finish those updates to by the beginning of October. So that's a different answer, because in that space we can actually do that. The technology is not as critical. Is on a schedule, but it's going to take us a little bit of time. So there is line of sight there. This number 1 there is difficult. One of the 2 items on the last line is also kind of talks about legacy technology that's very difficult to manage and sunset. And I think we have to kind of figure out how we deal with that risk. Again, from an audit perspective, I'm obligated to point out the risk. From a business perspective, they have to figure out if they're going to remediate it, or they're going to have to say, this is just impossible to do. We're going to have to live with the risk and put some walls around it. So the answer is a little different, but hopefully you're satisfied. If not, just let me know. I'll keep talking.
I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emil. I know that particular one is something that he said is deeply embedded, and we have to resolve it, so it's something that we can share, in another forum, but it's there, and it is a risk. We have to be able to acknowledge it. So, Mr. Floyd.
Well, since Jim brought this up, Collie, is there, all I know about this Atlanta situation is what I've seen in the paper. And so I'm wondering, is there some kind of briefing that you might give, a 2-minute briefing on exactly what happened, and were you aware of what was about to happen? And have we gotten some sort of formal request from Atlanta for information, that kind of issue?
Sure. You want me to address that right now?
Yes, please.
Okay. No, so we've had a series of meetings with City Council. On a quarterly basis, we go to them, they ask us questions at the briefings, we provide the answers, and what we don't have detail on, we send to them as follow-up. So there are a number of documents that we've sent to them that we believe answers the questions that they've been asking. Now, answering the question and making sure that the answer is fully appreciated or understood, we know that that's an iterative process, and those doors and those lines of communication remain open. In terms of the formal request or the press conference request for a financial audit, no, we learned of that the night before. Someone said that was going to happen. And so, they made their public plea. It's not that we needed to know that was coming. I think they have the right to ask for whatever they want to ask for. I think, MARTA's response in that, it's disappointing the disappointment comes in the way that request came. We believed in good faith that we were providing answers to the questions. If they were insufficient, then by all means, pick up the phone, make a phone call, pay a visit. And from what I understand, there have been a number of visits sort of behind the scenes with various groups in our various departments working through the questions that they have. And, it's not a binary thing. Once you answer first 5 questions, of course, there may be a subset of that. And so I believe it's an ongoing communication until both sides are very, very comfortable. But that was always MARTA's plan. Now that there's a request for something more formal, then we will, we'll simply capitulate to that and let that happen. But there was no sort of, open request that had gone unanswered for an audit or anything of that nature.
Did you get some kind of formal, have we gotten some kind of formal request from them for this audit?
Just the resolution. So there's a resolution that
We have received that.
that they have passed. I've seen it. I don't know if there's a more formal way to do it, but I believe that it's with the mayor's office. And my other belief is that the intergovernmental agreement has MARTA responding to the mayor on these matters. Technically not City Council. However, if we want to partner with each other in a good landscape of cooperation, then we should be answering everybody's questions. We just have to be careful about making sure that we don't go contra the intergovernmental agreement and start, pivoting and answering questions in that format for lack of a better word, on a whim. I think we should do it, on a more formal basis.
Thank you very much.
Thomas.
All right, Mr. Worthy.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just kind of want to put in an echo to some of the things that were said by Mr. Greenwood as it relates to being chairman of the board and share with y'all some of my thoughts. I think first and foremost, it is important to note exactly what Mr. Greenwood said, and that is we are an audit-friendly environment, and we are more than happy to participate in any audit that the mayor and his team may want to do. I also think that it's very important from my perspective, and I would like to get the board feedback on that. I know we normally don't do normal, kind of conversations in here, but I think from my perspective, for this to be an audit that everyone feels comfortable with, I think it should be a mutually agreed upon auditing firm, and I think the cost should be split 50-50 between the city and MARTA, because in my professional life, I know that whoever hires the audit firm and pays for the audit firm usually gets the better results that they are looking for. So for this to have the credibility with the council, with our stakeholders, with our customers, with us as a board, I think that it should be an audit firm that perhaps we haven't used before, that the city hadn't used before, that we agree upon mutually and pay the auditing fees directly 50-50.
All right, thank you. Any other comments from the board concerning the audit? Thank you, Mr. Mill. I appreciate it. Mr. Pond? Okay, I'm sorry.
Just one comment to what Thomas said. Wherever this goes, I still believe that this should have been solved outside of the news media. And to me, the CFO of MARTA could have sat down the CFO Atlanta and worked together and gone through this. And then if there were any concerns, then you could take the next step. But I would like to see, if we can, to have the two organizations internally address that with their professional staff. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. Mr. Dewar.
Al, I hear what you're saying. I think the city council is a different body. Okay. And the administration and the city council don't often come together in that way.
All right, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Mill. We appreciate you for the audit report. All right, thank you. The next item on the agenda is Mr. Dean, Mr. Dean Malice, Chief Information Security Officer. It's a cybersecurity briefing. All right.
Good morning, Chairman Frierson, excuse me, Ms. Hardage, Mr. Greenwood, members of the Audit Committee. This is the Information Security Update for March. It's last quarter. Next slide. I like to leave this slide on. People ask what cybersecurity really is, and cybersecurity is understanding and managing and mitigating the risks of our critical assets being disclosed, altered, or denied access to. I put that picture up. That really is not how hackers work. They're usually well-funded. The nation states, it's a business. So, but that's usually the perception of people have of what hackers do. Next slide, please. So, just to go over some of the implementations that the board items that were approved last year, our 24/7 365 monitoring implementation is complete. Our vulnerability management setup has been complete. That's our vulnerability scanner. That's our reporting. That's how we see where our risks lie in the authority. Penetration testing. So we have hired a third party to do we have new trains coming in 2025, so Stadler's building those, and those trains are highly automatic inside. They've got networks inside. So we hired a company to do design reviews at first, so we've completed our intermediate design review. We are meeting with the project team to go over those, to go over that report. Ultimately, what you want to do is when you find cyber issues, you want to address them early before you deliver a final product and have to try and bake cybersecurity into it at the end. We're also, with that firm, doing a penetration test on the current rail cars, and contracted with another vendor to do an enterprise penetration test, really focusing around our cloud applications. As Emil said, that is where things have been moving for the last 10 years, 15 years ago, if you ask the cyber professional. Risks. Some of the other initiatives that are happening, PCI, the payment card industry, every year we have to do an assessment to show that we meet the PCI Council standards for cybersecurity so that we can accept credit cards. We are soliciting for the qualified security assessor now. There are about 100 firms in the U.S. that can do this. So we've got a solicitation out to get a new firm. I like to rotate them every 2 to 3 years. You get fresh eyes on your environment. Emil mentioned identity access management. What we're focusing on this year is our privilege account management. Those are those accounts that have elevated privileges in the authority. So we're working to manage those and come up with methodologies so that those accounts can get rotated and passwords can get rotated so they're not keeping them consistently. Emil also mentioned third-party risk. We have a framework around third-party risks from my department, and we're expanding that this year so that we can continue to assess the third parties that we deal business with. We have started adding language into some of the RFPs and RFQs for organizations to have to meet basic cybersecurity before they can do business with MARTA. It's all about risk and managing our risk. And then back to cloud security. So that is a big risk for any organization, and we are working to get more exposure into that environment and bring specific tool sets in to manage that cloud environment. Not on my slide, but Emil mentioned TikTok. It is a risk. If you read through their acceptable, the end license user, it basically says we have access to all your data, but I think their response was, but we won't do anything with it. As a cybersecurity professional, it is not on my phone. I encourage people not to put it on theirs until they come up with remediations around that. And I believe that is the end of next slide, and that should be the end of my briefing.
Okay. Any other questions from the board? I do have one. This is for you, colleague. Being that we're having this broad discussion about TikTok, I know that I believe that there's embedded in our policy some other restrictions with third-party audits. But do we specifically address TikTok on any of our apparatus or equipments within the enterprise, Dean?
So we don't have a blanket against TikToks. We do have an acceptable use policy that only MARTA authorized software should be utilized on our devices, but we might have to take it a step up to ensure that we're not using something like that.
Okay, and how do we know that that these restrictive softwares are not being used? Is there some way in which we can make sure that that we know that it's not being used? I guess I'm asking.
So we have it's a little more challenging around on the cell phones.
Yeah.
In terms of, we don't have anything right now that really. If some of you work in some of these environments, they lock down the corporate cell phones, and unfortunately, we don't have many of those.
Mm-hmm.
We don't issue them to everyone. We do monitor our network to see what goes in and out, but when they're working over the cellular, it's something that becomes difficult for us to manage. Really, we try and manage it around an acceptable use policy, and then disciplinary action around people that are caught violating that policy.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, once again, this TikTok is elevated across the country, and I think we need to address it for this enterprise specifically, and I'd like to see some more conversation maybe from the board, or maybe your thoughts, colleague, on how we can have something in place that makes it clear that it's restrictive in terms of how we use it in the enterprise. Your thoughts?
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree, and I think for some of us, TikTok was not a challenge because it was never on our phones. It was never in our contemplation. But whether it's TikTok or the next iteration of something so attractive than something so galvanizing in the social media scene, MARTA has to stay the course. And I think Dean and his team are doing a very good job of that in saying these are the only acceptable uses for MARTA authorized equipment. And you know, just like anything else, our employees are expected to follow that code on the job and off the job, and you know, that whole code of ethics and self-management of your behavior goes beyond IT, goes beyond TikTok. But you know, to center on your point, we're absolutely in line with making sure there's no business need for it. So let's strip that away.
And that's key, whether there is a business need for any of the softwares that we use.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I wanted to add is for a work session coming up in April, I'm working with our FBI contact to bring him in to give us a threat briefing around critical infrastructure. I think it's important that the board understands what the threat landscape looks like. That has not been confirmed yet, but
Mm-hmm.
that is what I'm working on.
Okay, great. All right. All right, thank you. Any other questions from the board members? All right, Dean, thank you very much. We appreciate it. All right. Well, hearing no other comments from the board member, then I will adjourn the meeting. All right, thank you very much, everyone.